Continuing on with the series we've been on. The good news is I'm not a preacher, so I'm not going to preach at you, but I'm just going to give you what God's given me. We're still in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and really the verse is verse 10 that we're dealing with. But you got this. He's already there. Good. I thank Cody for helping me put together my slides and stuff. I had ideas of what I wanted, but had no idea how to get what I wanted. So Cody helped me put all that together, and I appreciate his help and everything. Like those before, I'm going to read 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 and 10. And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. The five things that are in verse 10 is the things that we were doing the series on, that he says he takes pleasure in. Go to the next slide, Bubby. The first one was reproach or infirmities, feebleness, disease, sickness, battling ourselves. That was done by Brother Gary. Go to the next slide. Next one was reproaches, insult, taunt, disgrace, scorn, shame, and that was done by Cody. Go ahead and go to the next one. Necessities, things we have to get through, being satisfied with what you have. Learn the difference between wants and needs, and that was by Brother Aaron. Going to the next one. And then persecutions, and that's the kind of definition that Tyler had there. I got a lot of this off Tyler's PowerPoint, the first part of it there. But and Tyler had persecutions. Now the last one we're going to do tonight is distresses. And go ahead and put the next slide, buddy. Actually, what a definition for distress is, but that's plural for distress. So here's the definition I found for distress: acute physical or mental suffering, pain, anxiety, or sorrow. Anything that causes pain, anxiety, trouble, or sorrow, affliction, trouble. A state of extreme necessity, misfortune, or trouble. The state of a ship or airplane requiring immediate assistance as when on fire in transit. The reason I went ahead and throw that fourth one in there, it's a good definition. Good definitions up there. But it's hard for me to wrap my mind about just what it is saying. And I kept trying to figure out the best way to say it, what it means, what it actually meant to me to be in distress or to be having distress. Go ahead and go to the next one, Bubby. SOS, which is actually the distress call of a ship in trouble. And that's a point of, man, all hope's lost just about. I'm in dire need. I'm in a hopeless situation. And that's kind of what the SOS is. It's a call of, and we're in distress. Things are bad. And distresses, to me, whether it be in physical pain or whether it be anxiety or emotional, it's reaching a point of just hopelessness. A point of, man, I got to have help. I can't take this no more. I'm sure a lot of people already are sitting there thinking about something they've gone through that they were just at that point. SOS. I got to have help. I'm in deep distress. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Bubby. I wanted to get an example out of the Bible. And this comes from 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 4. It says, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, it is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. This is Elijah. And basically, in his mind, all the other prophets have been killed. He's the only one left. And now Jezebel has basically told him, I'm going to get your life. You know, I'm going to take your life. He's run off into the wilderness, and he's reached this point of, as he said right there, it is enough. I've had it. I've had all I can stand. I can't take no more. He is in total distress. You know, he has no more hope. He just, okay, God, this is it. End it. Just take my life. You know, and a lot of us, I know, maybe never reached that point of praying for our life to be taken. But I think we've reached points of total distress like that. Go ahead and go next slide, Bo, if you want to. Just Elijah's SOS. That's what we were just talking about, Elijah's SOS. You know, this is a picture of the Titanic sinking. All hope was lost. It's over, you know. And that's where Elijah was at. A lot of us face things often in life where we're just downhearted. We're just so in distress. We don't know which way to turn, and we're just in distress. I guess the best way to say it. There's different things in life that can cause us to be in distress. Go ahead and go to the next one, Bubby. Financial distress. Terrible. I've been there. There was a time when basically we were in major distress. I had to get out of the house I was in one day. I had nowhere to go with my family, you know, and I was in distress. I didn't want to, praise God, He took care of it. But boy, there was a time in there when I was just, what am I going to do? And it was major stress. So financial is one that we face, a lot of people face, being in financial distress. Just, you can seem hopeless. I mean, it can be like there's no path, there's no way out of it. Go ahead and go next one, Bubby. Physical illness. And one reason I chose this picture was one we found. To be physically in pain, I've never really been there, but I've seen or heard of people in pain where I've had all I can stand. You know, be in distress, physical pain. But also I have been on the other side of that, where you're standing there, you're watching a loved one in that situation. And boy, you can get in distress. You can get in a hopeless situation. You can get where it's just, I can't take it no more. I just can't take it no more. Go on next slide, Bubby. Most of us have faced this one. If not, probably going to. But it's the death of a loved one. Boy, you can just, you can go through so much through that. Been through the death of both of my parents. Both of them was different. Both of them was a different kind of distress. But it's being at that point where but like I say, each one of us have our own personal times that we've been in distress, where we've been just no hope. Feel like just can't take it no more. Go on the next one, Bubby. This is a major point of distress for me and Donna. This is Cody when he was born. He's up at Norton's. He's hooked to all kinds of machines, all kinds of tubes. it was a major distress for us. First of all, I wasn't where I belonged with God, so I didn't have that arm to lean on. Actually, I did. I just didn't realize it was there. But I had a baby up in Louisville. Didn't know if it was going to live or die. Doctors told Donna not to be traveling, but I wasn't going to keep her from being with her baby. So we had her up there, worried about her in Louisville. I had no idea where Billy was even at. All I know is his family had him. And I was so worried about him. I felt like I was in 40 different directions. Major point of distress in our life. I just felt like, boy, I can't go on. I don't know what to do. And I don't know. So this is the way I kind of define distresses. And like I say, a lot of you have personal distresses. I know a lot of you were here when Donna lost her mother, and I know she got to the point where she talked to me, Brother Gary, she said, I can't pray. I can't find God. Man, I've been there. I've been there where are you at, God? I cannot find you. It's a tough situation to be in. Go on to the next slide, buddy. So I want to get back to what Paul said in verse 10. Therefore, I take pleasure in. And we've had the discussion on the infirmities and the reproaches and necessities and persecutions and distresses now. How can Paul say I take pleasure in? And that's kind of where I want to go with mine tonight. Distresses is a tough place to be in. I can't honestly right now say that I took pleasure in them. I take pleasure, and I know Donna will tell you the same thing, and some of the others have gone through things. I look back on it now, and I can say I praise God for holding me. I praise God for getting me through when I thought I couldn't get through it. But I just honestly, I can't say I take pleasure in being in distress. I can't. As my dad passed away, his final breaths were really rough. I had to sit beside his bed and hold him in the bed because each breath would cause his body to jerk and almost fall off the bed. That lasted for, seemed like days. It was, I'm sure, just a couple of hours or so, but I cannot say that I found pleasure in being in distress at that time. So how can Paul say that? How can Paul say, I take pleasure in? What has Paul got that I don't got? What is it about Paul that he can say? And, I want to know. I was trying to figure out what is it. We studied on this stuff, and I want to know. I'm trying to figure out what is it that Paul had? What is it? There's a first of all, I think there's a couple of things that Paul believed completely in his heart, and more than that, but there's a couple of main issues. Go ahead to the next slide, Bubby. Isaiah 41:10 says, "Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee, yea, I will help thee. Yea, I will uphold thee with the right hand of my righteousness." I believe Paul believed that completely. I believe Paul knew he was never, ever alone. And that God would always be there. God would always strengthen him. God would always take him through. I believe Paul had a complete belief in that. Go on to the next slide, bud. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose. I believe Paul believed this. I believe Paul knew that everything God was doing was for his good in the end. I believe Paul was totally committed to that, believing that. So I got thinking about, okay, I believe. I may not be as strong a believer as Paul was, but I believe that God never let me down. God will always be there. Even when I can't find him, he's there. He's with me. I believe that God's going to do everything for my good. It's for my good in the long run. But I still can't say I take pleasure in some of the things that's happened. And I know some of you all have been through some things that you just can't say I take pleasure in that. So why? Why can't I say that? Why can't I say I take pleasure in my infirmities, in my distresses? So what is it that Paul had? What is it about Paul that he could say that? That he could say, I take pleasure. One of the things is what Paul's desire was in life. What he cared about the most. What his whole reason for life was. Go on next slide, Bubby. James 4:15 says, for that you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or do that. God's will. His life was spent trying to serve God's purpose. His whole desire was to fulfill God's plan. And that's what, I don't think Paul worried about his end. What happened to him, what didn't happen to him, what he got, what he didn't get. Paul wanted God's plan to be fulfilled, regardless. And to me, what Paul found that I struggle, and I think a lot of us struggle, Paul figured out how to be a Christian. And what's a Christian? Christ-like. Christ-like. We all want to call ourselves Christians. Even in Sunday school this morning, we talked about that word gets thrown around a little bit loosely. I think Paul figured out how to be a Christian. He was Christ-like. What was Christ? Why did Christ come to this earth? Why did he go through all the things he went through on this earth? Why did he go and suffer and die? And I know our first instinct is to say, because he loved us, and I agree with that completely. But why did Jesus? I say Paul. Why was Jesus willing to go through all that? What was Jesus trying to accomplish? God's will. It was all about the Father's will. It was all about what God wanted, what God needed from him to accomplish his plan. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Bubby. Matthew 26:42 said he went away again a second time and prayed, saying, O my Father, if this cup may not pass away from me, except I drink it, thy will be done. I think that's the reason Paul could say, I pleasure in. Because Paul knowed that whatever he went through, whatever he had to face, was to accomplish God's plan, was to fulfill God's will. And it's easy for us to want to sit there and say, I want God's will. I want God's plan to be accomplished. I want God's will. But what if that costs us a loved one? What if I have to give up a child? What if I have to live without a home? Be homeless? What if I, do I really want God's plan, God's will, if that's the way it goes? I think that's the reason why I struggle to say within me, I take pleasure in these things. Because, and like most of us, I want God's will to be accomplished as long as it follows Danny's will or Danny's wants. And we get into that sometimes. And don't get me wrong. I don't think Paul enjoyed being beat. I don't think Paul enjoyed spending time alone, being lonely. You ever been lonely in a crowd? You know, I've been there where you just feel like you're all alone, even around people. You know, I'm sure Paul faced that so much. I think there's times when Paul had no idea where he's going to get his next meal, or, and I don't think Paul was saying, I enjoyed having that. I enjoyed that beating within that till I was within that much of my life. I don't think Paul was saying that. I don't think Paul would say I enjoyed losing my loved one, or I enjoyed being separated from my family, but he took pleasure in that what he was going through was going to be used to fulfill God's plan. His usage is still being fulfilled today. Paul, we're still using him today to accomplish and to get to where we need to be. And I think that's the reason Paul could say, I take pleasure in these things. So, to me, we need to learn to be Christian. We need to learn to be Christ-like. We need to be willing to say, okay, God, if this is what I go through, this is what you need to accomplish. And I'll be honest with you, my dad was probably the biggest example. I could never understand it, and I actually allowed the devil to turn me away from God for a while. My dad was a deacon in the church, and he wasn't just somebody's. He was going all the time. I can remember when I was a kid, it seemed like every night we were going somewhere to a revival. We went to church all the time. Never stopped. And my dad was gung-ho. He was wide open about it, and he served God. He was a man of action. I've always wished I could have been more like my dad, but wasn't meant to be. But when he was struck down with a disease, MS, and he got to where he could no longer get around, he had to start backing off and quit being a part of. And for the life of me, I could not understand. Okay, why? Why would you take somebody out that's doing something? You get all these people sitting in the church. They come every day, every Sunday. They sit there. They go home. They don't do nothing. Why would you take somebody like him who's action? And I could not understand for the longest time. But I know of two people now that'll tell you this day that the reason they're saved is because of the way my dad held himself as a Christian during his illness. And I heard my dad say before he died that I don't understand exactly why I had this. You know, he laid for, I know it's probably 12 years in a nursing home in a bed when all he could move was his head back and forth. Couldn't move no other part of his body at all. Like all the time. And he said, I didn't understand why it had to go like it did. He said, but if two were saved because they watched him, because how he said, it was worth it. That's receiving God's will. And I think to me that's where we need to get to. We need to be really, really willing to receive God's will regardless. And then we can say, I take pleasure in some of these things I've gone through. I take pleasure in knowing that God is fulfilling a plan and God is using me to fulfill his needs. And that's all I have. I think we need to pray that God will show us how to get to that, taking pleasure. Like I say, I know distresses we can all probably tell us some we've actually been in pretty bad distresses. Most of us have a good testimony of how God took us through those distresses, how God held us up, and we can praise God and everything. But I'd like to get to the point where I can say, I take pleasure in knowing that something was accomplished for God's plan by what I went through. That's all I have. Yes, brother, you want to come up and give us a song?